If a person with an average salary wanted to accumulate Elon Musk's fortune, they would have to work for 8 million years. That is 30 times longer than humanity has existed. And while you are listening to these words, Elon has already made another $100,000. But the most surprising thing about Musk is that he is far from being the richest person in history. In fact, he doesn't even come close to that title. If we look back in time, we will find people next to whom he looks almost poor. But who is the richest person to ever live on Earth? If we start from the late 1980s, the picture is shocking. Let's look at the Colombian billionaire whose name became synonymous with the cocaine empire. Pablo Escobar was earning an astonishing $420 million every week. But even accounting for inflation, his fortune never exceeded $80 billion. On paper, he could not surpass Elon Musk. However, the difference with Escobar was that his money was not in stocks or corporate assets, but in actual cash. He literally spent $1,000 every week just on rubber bands to bundle his banknotes. Moreover, losses from damaged cash reached $2 billion a year. Escobar was not the richest man in history in the classical sense, but if we count only cash, then at some point he might have claimed this title. Still, it was a dark and criminal way of making money. Let's move to 1945. World War II had ended. Millions of American soldiers were returning home to build families and work in factories where a single income was enough for a decent life. The American dream looked very real back then, but on the other side of the world, in devastated Europe, there was a man who can be considered one of the richest in history. Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, was not interested in money in the usual sense. He had almost no personal belongings except for pipes, books, and a simple military uniform. Yes, he lived better than his citizens, had access to food and certain privileges, but he did not surround himself with luxury. His salary was about $30,000 in today's terms, but according to his son, he simply piled up his paychecks and never used them. It is unlikely he even had a bank account. The secret was different. Stalin did not own billions of dollars. He owned an entire state. Any attempt to doubt his authority could cost a person their life. A joke or careless word, and the way to the gulag or execution was open. When Stalin suffered a stroke, doctors did not dare call for help for over 12 hours, fearing he might wake up and punish them for acting without his orders. Formally, he was poor, but in fact, he controlled an economy that today would be valued at around $10 trillion. To determine the richest person in history, we need to think broader than just money. Wealth can be expressed in shares, in power, in resources, or in real gold. Each figure in this story represents their own era and their own kind of might. Now let's move to 1909. On the streets of Vienna wandered a homeless failed artist. Adolf Hitler dreamed of entering the Academy of Fine Arts, but he was not accepted. He survived by selling cheap paintings and postcards, spending nights in hostels. It seemed his fate was to remain poor. After World War I, he began his political activity and even attempted a coup, for which he ended up in prison for nearly a year. There, he wrote a book that later became infamous. At first, it sold poorly, but as the situation in Germany worsened, its popularity grew. In 1933, after coming to power, Hitler made a cunning move. The state bought millions of copies of his book and handed them out to soldiers and newlyweds. He exempted himself from taxes, registered copyright on his image and speeches, earning money even from postage stamps and newspapers. This brought him millions. By the end of his life, his book had sold about 10 million copies. For comparison, Anne Frank's diary sold 3 times more. But besides that, from 1933 to 1945, Hitler received over $5 billion in donations from his supporters, mostly from industrialists. All this made him wealthy on paper, but his real fortune came from military power. In 1942, Nazi Germany controlled almost all of Europe, plundering resources worth hundreds of billions and using millions of people as forced laborers. In today's terms, resources under Hitler's control amounted to about $3 trillion, but those were horrific and bloody riches, not worth admiration. After dictators who built their empires on blood and war, came a completely different approach to wealth. It was the era of industrial giants, people who changed not just markets, but the very structure of society. In 1914, Henry Ford made a move that seemed insane to most businessmen of his time. He doubled workers' wages from $2.5 to $5 a day and reduced the work week from 6 to 5 days. At first glance, this should have ruined the company, but instead, a miracle happened. Workers began to produce more, and most importantly, they could afford to buy the cars they were making. Ford introduced the assembly line, inspired by slaughterhouses, where animals were cut up in stages. The result was staggering. The time to assemble a Ford Model T dropped from 12 hours to 90 minutes. The cost of the car fell from $850 to $290, and millions of Americans could now afford a car. Thanks to this, Ford didn't just make billions, he changed the very culture of life. People began moving out of cities and commuting to work. Suburbs appeared, along with a new rhythm of modern life. Ford's methods were copied around the world, and although his personal fortune is estimated at around $200 billion, his influence on billions of people's lives makes him a contender for the title of the richest in history. Ford's success would have been impossible without those who laid the groundwork back in the 19th century. This was a time when the world was only beginning to acquire electricity, telephones, and railroads. Air pollution was seen as a sign of progress, child labor was the norm, and laws protecting workers simply did not exist. Workers risked their lives every day for pennies, while on the other side of the scales stood men who built entire empires. The first of them was Cornelius Vanderbilt. He built his fortune on railroads and shipping. When he died, his wealth exceeded the money in the US Treasury. Next came Andrew Carnegie. He made his fortune in steel and then gave almost all of it away to charity. And this was at a time when there were no tax benefits for donations. He truly gave his money, not for profit, but out of conviction. But the richest of the robber barons was John D. Rockefeller. In 1870, he founded Standard Oil and soon turned it into a monster that controlled almost the entire oil industry in America. By the 1880s, his company controlled 90% of the country's oil refining. Rockefeller was not shy about stepping over others. He lowered prices to bankrupt competitors and then bought their businesses for pennies. As a result, his fortune grew at a fantastic pace. But in 1911, the US Supreme Court declared Standard Oil a monopoly and ordered it to be broken up into 34 companies. At first glance, this should have destroyed his empire, but the opposite happened. Rockefeller kept shares in all the new companies, and their value skyrocketed. He became even richer. After this, Rockefeller went down in history as the first dollar billionaire in the world. In 1913, his fortune amounted to about 2% of the entire US GDP. By modern standards, this is between $400 and $600 billion. This made him one of the most realistic contenders for the title of the richest person in history. But long before Rockefeller, there were dynasties that ruled entire nations through finance, and among them stood out a family whose name became legendary. Rockefeller became a symbol of the industrial era, but even earlier, there was a family whose wealth and influence extended far beyond one country. They were the Rothschilds. In 1744, Meyer Amschel Rothschild was born in a Jewish ghetto in Frankfurt am Main. He started as a dealer in rare coins, but soon moved into banking. His idea was brilliant. Send his 5 sons to the largest financial centers in Europe: London, Paris, Vienna, Naples, and Frankfurt. Each son ran a bank in his city, and together they created the first international banking network long before the telegraph and telephone. The Rothschilds financed wars, helped nations recover after crises, and built massive projects like the Suez Canal. Their money could save or ruin the economy of an entire country, but at the same time, they had to live under constant restrictions. Jews were forbidden from owning land and real estate, so the family invested their wealth in bonds, stocks, and debts, assets that could not be confiscated. At the peak of their power, the dynasty possessed a fortune that many historians call the greatest in history. Modern estimates vary greatly, from hundreds of billions to an incredible $500 trillion. Of course, it is impossible to determine exact figures. On an individual level, the richest member of the family was Nathan Rothschild. His fortune was valued at tens of billions in today's money, but far more valuable were his connections and influence. He could dictate terms even to monarchs. However, not only bankers shaped the history of wealth. In 15th and 16th century Europe, there lived a man whose name is now known only to historians, but whose influence on the economy was immense. After bankers and dynasties came those who ruled entire continents. In the 16th century, Jakob Fugger, a German banker, lent money to kings and even financed the election of Emperor Charles V. His fortune was estimated at hundreds of billions of dollars in today's terms. But if we look even deeper into history, rulers come to the forefront. whose power extended over vast territories and immense resources. In the 14th century, Mansa Musa, king of Mali, controlled half of the world's gold reserves. His pilgrimage to Mecca was accompanied by such lavish distribution of wealth that local economies literally collapsed. His fortune is often called the largest in history, about $400 billion, and possibly more. A century before him, Genghis Khan created an empire that covered 1/5 of the earth's land. Formerly, he had no personal treasures. He shared the loot with his warriors, but the very fact of controlling such a vast territory makes him a special case. In ancient Rome, power and wealth were concentrated in the hands of Augustus Caesar, whose fortune today would be valued at $5 trillion. And even earlier, the biblical King Solomon amassed gold by the ton, and legends call him the richest man of antiquity.